Before we start today's episode, I've got some big news. Embroidered hats, shirts and sweatshirts featuring the Casual Birder podcast artwork are now available to buy. Visit the link in the episode notes. Welcome to the Casual Birder podcast. I'm Suzy Buttress. As a casual birder, I take pleasure in watching the wild birds around me, wherever I am. In my show, I share the joy of birding. I tell you about the birds I've seen, speak with experts and enthusiasts, go on bird outings, and I share stories from birders around the world. In case you missed it, last episode I sat down with John, my husband, as we reviewed a birding weekend we'd taken at Key Haven on the Hampshire coast, where we speak about the waders and other birds that we saw. Do take a listen. This episode is brought to you by Casual Birder Weekly, the show's newsletter. I connect with you in lots of places, the show's Facebook group, Instagram and Twitter, but because of the hectic pace of social media, it's not easy to make sure that everyone has seen the latest news. Casual Birder Weekly is a great way for us all to stay in touch. Sign up now. The link is in the episode notes. Do you put food out for your garden birds? I've several tube-style feeders around my garden containing sunflower hearts, and I get a lot of enjoyment from watching the birds that come to feed at them. Although the food gets eaten reasonably quickly, if there's a spell of wet weather, the seed gets damp and mouldy, and along with that, I know that diseases can be spread by infected birds visiting the feeders. I don't want my garden visitors to become ill as a result of visiting my feeders, but I'm not as careful about keeping them clean as I should be. Every now and then, I take my feeders down and give them a good clean, taking them all apart piece by piece, washing with hot soapy water, letting them air dry, then putting them back together and refilling them. This task can take a good hour, especially with the different feeder designs, needing to find a screwdriver to undo the fiddly screws and nuts that you don't want to drop and lose. Even the feeders that pull apart have lots of different sections to be reassembled, and unless it's a sunny day, I'm not very good at making time for the task. If only there was a feeder that made cleaning easier and kept food clean and dry. When I was at the Global Bird Fair back in July, I visited the Finches Friend stand. I was interested in a window feeder at the time and was drawn to the design of the one on display. It showed an easily removable cartridge that held the food and which provided perches for the birds to access the food without them standing in it. I spoke to author and broadcaster Martin Hughes-Games, who was on the stand. He showed me the cleaner feeder tube design, and I was intrigued to see that the feeding area is kept away from the seed storage, and the ease of removing the feeding area for cleaning had me very interested. Martin explained that the novel design of the Finches Friend feeders was due to inventor and engineer Dick Woods, founder of Finches Friend, who wanted a way to prevent disease spreading through garden bird populations, while still enjoying the visits of birds to his feeders. I was impressed by the passion and care that had led to the development of the feeders, and I invited Martin and Dick to speak about the unintended consequences of providing supplementary feeding for garden birds, and how the cleaner feeder helps to mitigate them. I will say up front that I was offered a Cleaner Feeder 1 to try in my own garden, and I've been really impressed with it. It's so easy to keep clean that I do it far more frequently than I did with my old feeders, and, despite the novel design, the birds soon learned where to feed from and now visit regularly. In fact, it's brought species in that I hadn't seen for some time in my garden, such as greenfinches and coal tits. This interview was recorded on Zoom, and this podcast episode is an edited version of that call. If you wish to watch the interview instead, it'll be on my YouTube channel. Although, please note that at the time of recording, I'm having major PC issues, so it may be a little while before the video is available. Good morning, Dick and Martin. Thank you so much for joining me on the Casual Birder podcast. We're here this morning to talk about feeding garden birds and perhaps the unintended consequences that come along with that and what we as responsible bird watchers can do. Could you please introduce yourselves?
My name is Dick Woods, and I'm the founder of Finches Friend Wildlife, a business that I began purely based on the problems with wild bird health.
I'm Martin Hughes-Games. I'm ex-Springwatch and various other programmes on the BBC, and now a full-time daddy with a 6-year-old. But I was trained as a zoologist initially, and I've kind of never let that go. It's always been my passion, my interest. I got involved by accident, in a way, with the Finches Friend feeders. I had no idea about the issues that Dick was trying to address. And in fact, it was because I spoke to Chris Packham, bizarrely. And I said, well, how can a feeder be any different, Chris? He said, no, you really, really want to look into this. There's a very serious issue going on out there. And I think this is something you should get involved with. So really, that's the reason I got involved. It's because of a conversation with Chris.
I've been using one of the Finches Friend feeders for several weeks now. And I can see many, many benefits of using them. But I know it's not just about the feeders. Can you tell us a bit more about why it is that we enjoy feeding garden birds so much and what perhaps we should be considering when we do that?
Yeah, it's been going on for a very, very long time. It goes right back 3,000 years in India. It's sort of part of your karma was you should feed garden birds amongst other animals. But I think it really took off in the UK and in the States around 1900. There were some very severe winters back then, and it became almost government policy to say, can you please look after your birds? Can you feed the birds? And people got quite concerned about that in these very severe winters. And my goodness, how it has taken off now, because it's estimated 49% of the UK families actually feed birds, which is astonishing, really. And it's more than astonishing, because if, say, 33 million of families are feeding birds, what goes on those feeders and around those feeders may be critically important to those garden bird populations if it's a big an issue as that. Indeed, it has become a massive issue because, okay, there's really nice positive things. I mean, David Attenborough himself, he says that what he loves is to sit out in the garden, and if you put a feeder out, which is one of the easiest things to do, and very inexpensive, but it brings nature into your garden, and it's joyful. It's for me, for all of us, to see all these different birds coming in, and that sense that you're doing something to help them, because there they are feeding, and you hear them singing, and you see chicks, and it's people's access to nature somehow that brings them into your garden. It's a wonderful thing to do, and you get this glow thinking, I'm helping them. But it's become apparent that because they're coming into those feeders in such high numbers, maybe we're not always helping. There are other issues that we really have to consider about bringing the birds into our gardens. And actually, there's nothing new about that. When I look back in the history, even way back in America in particular, people were already concerned that it might be slowing populations or increasing the chance of the transmission of disease, which is our big one, or bringing other creatures into your garden that you might not want. There's a fantastic picture that I've got of a bear on a garden feeder in America. So I mean, we have squirrels and things to learn about, but the big one and the deadly serious one is disease, because if it's possible that there is disease in the form of parasites, viruses, fungi, bacteria on our garden feeders, we're going to pass it on. And that is what happened. And Dick noticed in his garden. And that's what started his journey off, because he saw what was happening to the birds in his garden.
Dick, what was it that you were noticing with your garden birds that sent you on this train of thought and now action?
This goes back 8 to 10 years. I live in an old converted barn with a nice big garden in East Kent. And as Martin was describing, enjoyed the birds. And we ended up with about 3 or 4 of the biggest feeders that I could find and hung them around the place. And we had green finches in numbers that we couldn't believe. It built up 2 or 3 years to a point where we had 60 or 70 green finches that almost lived with us. They were constantly there. The feeders were empty in no time. We filled them. I had no clue, no idea in any way about disease on feeders. It had never been something that crossed my mind. And we suddenly had this kind of event going on, which took us a few weeks to really understand, where pretty well all of those green finches died. And we were finding them around the place. Initially, they become lethargic, easy to approach and stuff, and you just know something's wrong. And this basically wiped out the greenfinches that we had. So at that stage, I researched it a little bit, read up on what was going on and what I could find. And that's when I learned about trichomoniasis. So whilst I've got no scientific proof that those birds died of trichomoniasis, I think it's almost certain that that's the case. So it's a parasitic disease. The way that it affects the birds is effectively it creates lesions in their throat. They stop being able to swallow. They effectively go onto the feeder, try and feed. As they try and feed, they drool, and then the parasite is passed on to the next bird. So that was the thing that kicked it all off. I'm a kind of an inventor in different ways by trade, but mostly from an industrial background. And I kind of got this itch that I had to scratch that went on for several years, where I'm driving or working in somewhere, whatever, and I just spend my time thinking, how can I find a solution, a feeder that's easy to clean, because people don't clean them. They know they should clean them, but it's a pain. It's a horrible job. And it's something that I did annually and didn't really understand that I was doing anything wrong. And I think generally it's just a job that had to be made easier. So the solution was as much about human beings as it was about birds. It's actually understanding that in truth, there are genuinely people that clean their feeders every day, every couple of days, every week. There are people that do that, but the vast majority of people are not aware, don't clean their feeders, and hence I wanted to create feeders that were easy to clean and kept the food dry, and that's really where Finches Friend came from.
Can I just dive in there and put some numbers on what Dick was actually seeing there? In a Royal Society paper that was published in 2018, that they actually discovered that the greenfinch population, we'd lost 66% of all our greenfinches between 2006 and 2016. That's 2.8 million individual birds to this disease. And so that's 280,000 birds per annum. Can you imagine if we'd seen that, if we'd seen those birds falling out the sky? And that is, I'm quoting from the paper now, it's the largest scale infectious disease impact on a European wild bird on record. And that meant that the greenfinch went from a species of least concern to being now on the red list because of this disease passed on or around feeders. People just don't realise that.
So this disease was existing in nature, but because birds weren't congregating in such large numbers at a single point, the disease couldn't be passed on quite so easily. And I think even though it was in the news a little bit, I still don't think people really took it in that this was such a big problem. But hearing you describe the loss of those birds is just shocking. And it's not just greenfinches that were affected, was it?
No, it's not. Another paper's just come out September of this year, just last month, in Nature, and quite clearly the chaffinch population is declining. It's not quite so clear. I mean, it's declining dramatically now, and there's no doubt about it. It's also trichomoniasis related. There are issues about which birds and which period in their life cycles they're coming to feeders and so on. But there's no doubt about it at all. This latest paper said exactly the same thing. Greenfinches and chaffinches are going down. Of course, other finches too, goldfinches and other garden birds will become infected.
I'd certainly had a couple of cases in my own garden over the years, and I'd seen collared doves with similar lesions and lethargic.
It was originally a disease in pigeon populations, and it made the transition. So I'm sure you're seeing exactly the same thing. Yeah, but I have to say, on our feeders, there are many other things. Maybe bird flu is going to be passed on there as well. And avian pox, salmonella, there are other things that can be passed on. It's just an increasing awareness of what's going on. And as Dick's going to explain, not just on the feeders themselves, we've got to try to think about what's happening around the feeders and in drinking water, of course. You imagine, when do we change our drinking water? And they're standing in that. You see, it's a much broader issue, and we're trying to raise awareness.
Dick, tell us a bit more about the wider garden worries.
I have a little mantra I call food, feet and feces. And I believe that as from a design perspective and from a user perspective, those are really useful things to remember. So if we think about food, we really want to provide food that is dry and clean. That's the first thing with food. Then we really want to keep the birds' feet and feces out of the food that we provide and the water we provide. Now that sounds quite straightforward, but it's actually incredibly difficult. Who doesn't love to see a bird in the bird bath? You know, they're flying around, they're having a pleasurable experience. It gives us a pleasurable experience. But the reality of it is, Martin gives a figure of 1 in 8, I believe it is, correct me if I'm wrong, Martin, of birds that carry some form of disease. So we can actually look at it and say, for every 8 birds that go into that bird bath, 1 is carrying a disease of some description. Every bird that goes onto our feeder, 1 in 8 will have it. So we have to look at the environment around our feeders, one particular area, and it's an area that came up in an interesting discussion I was involved in recently, where we're looking at what happens under the feeders. Chaffinches, which, as Martin said, have recently started to suffer significantly from trichomoniasis, they're primarily ground feeders. So what's happening is that the birds on the feeders are consuming the food, whatever the remainder of the seed that they're consuming gets pushed away, spat out, whatever, down onto the ground. And that's the area, often damp, usually a piece of turf or something like that the ground feeders will go to. And I personally, and I must make it clear that this is my personal view, but I think that the trichomoniasis in chaffinches now is primarily picked up on the ground, not so much on feeders, although clearly it certainly can be. It's saliva-based, and in a damp environment, the parasite lives longer than in a dry environment. So I'm interested in looking at interceptors, which would be some form of structure between the feeder and the ground that actually picks up those discarded seeds or whatever, and then doesn't enable other species to or other birds, whether they be ground feeders or even things like rats and stuff, which do get under feeders, to be able to exploit that food. So I think the future will be interceptors of some description will be best practice. And again, water should be provided in a way that the birds can't physically get in it and stand in it. Even things like water features in your garden. There's an interesting point that I learned recently, that there are spikes in the year, and September is one where trichomoniasis becomes much more serious as an issue. And I don't think that's publicised well enough. There are spikes. There are times of year when it's much more serious. So there are a myriad of different places and points in the garden beyond just the feeders where it's possible to transfer disease.
I've certainly noticed in my own garden over the years that where the seed fell, you'd get matted mould and all sorts of horrible slimy areas under the feeder. And I was seeing at that time the doves in my garden with the lesions and things. And I didn't know for sure that was what was causing it, but it didn't look healthy. And I didn't want to hurt my birds. What you're saying about the water features is very interesting. And I'd like to look at that a bit more later on. You've mentioned some of the things that you feel or you have seen in your own experiences with the birds walking through food, defecating in food, having access to food lying around, that has made you think carefully about this feeder that you've designed. So could you tell us a little bit about what features you felt were important to have in a good garden feeder? Yeah,
for sure. So we go back to the food, feet and feces. So we want to keep the food dry. That's a huge part of the problem. We want food mold-free and dry. On a conventional feeder, you will have a number of holes around the side with obviously perches and enabling the birds to stand at the side of the feeder and feed. By their very nature, those holes are enabling water ingress. They just have to. Doesn't matter how well they're designed or whatever, the food can get damp and wet. So at the point, if you imagine our diseased bird feeding through a hole, effectively the parasite has now transferred it from the bird to the food, and that food then, as it's consumed, slowly drops down through the feeder. So it's actually spreading it around, not just the point that the bird originally introduced it, but through other parts of the food as well. So the food becomes contaminated. We then also have issues like mold and those kinds of things that we get as soon as food is damp.
Just coming in to say, on the video version of the interview, Dick shows us a cleaner feeder and explains the design. So I'll give a quick description here, and in the episode notes you'll find a link to finchesfriend.com where you can view photos and videos of the feeder. The Cleaner Feeder 1 is a large tube feeder with a wide clear barrel that holds the seed. There's a rubber ring lining the lid to ensure the seed is kept clean and dry. A gutter runs around the base of the seed storage to keep rain off the feeding station below. Food passes into the feeding station from the storage container above, and the birds sit on a perch to eat the seed. I'll hand over back to Dick.
So the first thing that we've done is to create that situation where this is a sealed area. The food simply has to stay dry and clean in here. And then we move to the underside. This is what we call the feed station. So this is the area where the birds can perch and where they can feed. And we know that the food that's coming down into that area is dry and clean and free of disease. So what we then do is make that area easy to clean. So we have basically a rotation mechanism, some simple clips underneath, and then we can take that piece off and clean it. And that's the key. But the reality is the food can stay dry in there. You don't have to take it out of the feeder. And then this is the bit you clean. It takes 5 minutes. It's really easy. Dip it into a bucket of hot water, weak disinfectant, and just give it a good slosh off and a good wipe down. Make sure it's dry before you put it back on. And then it's simply reinstalled and you're feeding again. So we're dealing with the actual issues of the disease, and we're dealing with the human element where people are, want to do the right thing, but in the real world, do we? So that's the concept. That's what's behind that feeder. A little later, perhaps I'll run through the window version, which is quite interesting, which again has separated food, feet and feces.
That feeder, you very kindly sent me one to try, and it's taken a little while for the birds to realise where the food is. I've had a few sitting on the guttering at the top, looking at the food, wondering how to get it. But once one or two find it, then others spot it. But I have to say, I try to be a responsible feeder. I try to, keep my feeders clean. But it is such a hassle to take them apart. And, most of them have got these little screws and nuts. And I do it, but I really don't do it very regularly. And since I've had this Finches Friend feeder, I've been doing it weekly. And what I love about it, apart from the absolute ease of cleaning, which is just a doddle, but what I like about it is as you twist it, you're closing off the reservoir. So you know that the rest of the seed is still there. It's waiting to be released again. And I can be confident that I've got a clean feeder. I've still got some of the other style feeders in my garden, and I'm phasing those out because this is absolutely, for me, a game changer. Can you tell us about the window feeder?
So the issue with window feeders generally is that they are simply a tray of some description. There is no attempt made on any window feeders to actually keep the birds out of the food. So this was a key objective, and this is the biggest product launch that we've done this year. So basically, this is the perch, and here is the food. So unlike tray feeders, there's no opportunity for the birds to actually land in the food or land next to it and decide to wander through it, and simply adheres onto the window with suction pads as other feeders do. There's a simple little lever that enables you to remove the feed station. So the concept is the same. In this case, all of the food comes out with it, but there's a relatively small amount to consume. So often these actually empty in a day. The point you made earlier, Suzy, about taking time for the birds to get used to these, often they won't use a window feeder if they've got a safe source of food already to eat next to it. It really is something. Nature's nature. You can't dictate to them where they'll eat where they choose. But the concept here is food, feet and feces. We keep the food clean and dry, keep the birds' feet and feces out of the food. And this is a very simple little device a lot of time and effort went into developing a method of keeping window feeders clean.
Can I just dive in, Suzy, and just say, Dick is not a birder, was not a birder. He's an industrial designer. He designs all sorts of heavy, enormous metal things. And that's what so impressed me, that he was able to turn that inventiveness, that in the industrial sort of area, into these feeders because he cared so passionately about the birds in his garden. So he wasn't coming at it like I would as a zoologist or something like that. He came at it because he was passionate, he wanted to do something, and he had those inventive skills to actually do something about it. And I've got to be a bit controversial here, because we've had a number of meetings, I'm not going to mention any names, with research organisations, some of them very well known. And although they've done very good research into what's been going on, I get no sense of urgency that we should do something about it. And indeed, some of them are still selling feeders that if you look at them, you think, with the knowledge, with what we've been talking about, that they're almost designed to pass on disease. So I'm a bit disappointed in the research organisations. Yes, they're doing the research, but it's almost as if they said, this is the new normal and we'll stick with this, rather than saying, this is an emergency. 66%, they're on the red list. And I'm concerned for Dick, who's putting all this effort in and not inconsiderable sums of his own money, and he's not being kind of supported at all. So I just thought I'd throw that in. Sorry, Dick, but people need to know that this is all your own work and you're coming at it from an industrial design point of view, which is why I think they're so incredibly clever and so easy to clean. Because as you say, Suzy, I've got the other ones. You pull the pin out, they all fall out everywhere, and you don't do it. Whereas now, every weekend, take it off, clean it. And it's even got to the point where my fat ball feeders, which are not Finches Friend feeders, because I'm cleaning the others, I clean them as well, because yes. I know what I've got to do. But I think if we can get this more widely understood, then the bird populations are going to owe Dick a very, very hearty vote of thanks.
No, absolutely. And I agree with you, to have someone coming at it from a non-birder perspective. Yes, you enjoy birds in your garden, as many other people do, but actually taking the applications that you already had, having the knowledge that you've already had, and thinking the problem through and coming up with something so innovative. I've not seen anything else like this anywhere on the market. So, I've been absolutely impressed with it. Now, I know we were saying earlier that some of the finches that have been absolutely decimated by this disease, but other birds are also affected by disease. And I know that there are people who would say, actually, we shouldn't be feeding birds at all, because there are changes, and I think you hinted at this a little bit earlier, Martin, there are changes to the ecosystem with birds. Some birds take very readily to feeders, and then that can cause a kind of population explosion because the food is readily available and it can push out other birds. And I know there's a big movement for people to not feed birds at all, but to provide gardens that have natural food sources. I absolutely can see the benefits of that, and it's something that, if you're lucky enough to have a garden, it's something we can work towards, but it takes a long time to develop that kind of habitat, whereas putting a feeder out, it's almost instant. Birds in the neighbourhood will be used to coming to feeders. Would you have any advice about what other kinds of feeding stations or other things we can do to help the other birds that will want to come to the garden that aren't finches?
It's a very troubling issue, and one that we had all the time on Spring Watch. Should you feed them? The pros and cons of feeding your garden birds. The current thinking from the latest BTO research is that overall, it's a good thing and it benefits the garden birds. I think that should be under review at all times. I think there are cases, particularly in the light of the disease transmission, but also because I think there is a case, as Dick has just suggested, due to the bird's biology, that we might stop feeding at certain times of the year. But that's a very difficult one, because if the RSPB came out and said, please stop would people do it? Because you're dealing with people's psychology. It's a delightful thing to have them come into the garden. And I think we should do that for another reason. I think the only way we're going to get the message through to people about disease transmission is to do something dramatic. And based on research, say, no, please stop feeding garden birds in autumn or whatever the research says. So that'll make headlines. People will say, whoa, why? And then you can say, because of the transmission of disease, because so far we're just not getting the message through.
It is a tricky one because people have such relationships with the birds that come to their garden. But you need to take responsibility. If you're going to start feeding birds, you can't just shove a feeder out there and hope for the best.
From the perspective of just my opinion, I believe that there is a real argument for limiting feeding in country locations in the summer. And that's where my mind is going at the minute, or certainly in late summer. But I think we need to look at urban situations as against rural situations. I think it's more about the environment in the area than simply a blanket do or don't feed.
You also mentioned earlier about water and water features and about birds bathing and that not being such a good thing. Could you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a difficult thing for me to say it's not a good thing. It's just purely that going back to my theory that the birds shouldn't defecate in the food or drink that they have, and they shouldn't walk in it, means that for me, the future in water, in drinkers, if you like, is some form of a bowl with if you imagine a big dish and a small dish, and you invert one and put it inside the other so that there's effectively a ring around the outside that birds can access to drink from, but they can't get in it. That's the kind of way that my mind is going in terms of probably what is right for water. But unfortunately, these things are incredibly expensive to develop. It costs around about £80,000 for me to bring a product to market. My next product is for peanuts. I'm very, very concerned about peanut feeders. They're generally full of mouldy, horrible, wet, not fed in any particular order. The peanuts can be in there for months and not get consumed. So the next thing for Finches Friend, as we can afford to do it, will be a cleaner peanut feeder, which is already developed. And then I think we will go on to water. We may pursue the issue around cleaner bird tables. And I'm very interested in the interceptor idea that I touched on earlier. We're
always told that birds need to have water to condition their feathers. They need to bathe. But, I can see how, in fact, the bird bath, I've got several dishes and baths around the garden, and they're the things that get cleaned much more frequently than my feeders, because you can see straight away they're going, they get algae in them. You can see when a bird has pooped in them. You just know they need to be cleaned out. But I'm thinking of things like water features. Sometimes you see edges of ponds that have got stones in that are shallow for wildlife to be able to use. And something like that you can't really clean. So what are your views about those kinds of features?
Anything we can do to improve the situation is good. And I think Dick's point about having a drinker, which I had not heard about actually until we were doing this podcast, that allows birds to drink. In fact, my chickens, their drinkers are exactly like that, actually. They can't poo into it. But birds will always find somewhere to bathe. They can find somewhere to bathe, and if it's a stream or it's outside, it's not going to have that aggregation, that focus, that concentration of potential disease products, feces, and so on. So I'm beginning to think, yes, I'll provide the water for them to drink, but I'm not going to provide water for them to wash in. However, I have to say you're absolutely right, Suzy. I've dug 2 ponds. That's the first thing I did when I moved into my house. And yes, I often get birds coming down to those ponds, particularly in the drought times. And they came down there and they were cleaning themselves. But at least it's a larger body of water. I'm not going to provide any bird baths anymore in my garden. Drinkers, yes, but not baths.
You mentioned earlier, which we didn't really go into, the rewilding side of things, of what we can actually do in our gardens to provide habitat. I think that's a really interesting area. And it's an area that almost anyone can bring something to the party, no matter how small their garden is or whatever. And I do think that there is a mix here. that we should provide supplementary feeding for the birds, but we should also do everything we can to provide habitat that fits with ponds and water features and those things. So I wouldn't want to suggest that from my perspective, they're just bad. In fact, I think the bigger the body of water that you can provide, the better chance there is that disease would simply be dispersed and become irrelevant. In my own situation at home, I'm lucky I've got maybe half an acre. We've taken areas that we simply don't mow anymore and let them do their own thing. And the rewards are incredible. We do get goldfinches that will feed on seed heads and stuff. But in our case, it's frogs and toads and those kinds of things. We found our first toad last week was a joy. So there is no doubt that what you can gain from just simply letting a small area go its own way or finding some plants that are good for the birds and trying to add them in and grow them. For me, it's an as well as, not an instead of, but it's really important.
Also, from a sort of ornithological point of view, of course, many bird species will switch their diets through the year. Some of them will provide insect food for their chicks. And so if you're providing some rewilded area, you're going to increase the number of insects around. Try to remember, we're losing insects at a fantastic rate. We've lost 70% of our insect populations. That's the baseline for so much wildlife. So I would emphasize that it's a bigger issue, even beyond what we're talking about. I would say, on a slightly more optimistic note, around me, I live in a little village in Somerset, I've been surprised to see how many people have left areas of their garden. They're not all mown flat like bowling greens. They have left little bits for rewilding, which is incredibly encouraging. So I think that message kind of is getting through. And as Dick says, you've only got to do a little bit and you'll be amazed at the amount of wildlife that will come in to that bit you've left alone or the pond that you've dug. And it's, as well as the birds in our garden, that can be deeply satisfying and psychologically calming.
Absolutely. I do wonder, because we've done this ourselves, we don't mow as much as we used to. And I wonder if we just needed to be given permission not to. There was always this idea, you had this little bowling green lawn and you had to be out there mowing it into stripes and everything. And I think the idea of no mow May and all these other things have been amazing, because it's actually okay to leave dandelions and clover out there and to see the bees on it and just have that buzz in your garden and see all sorts of hoverflies and all sorts of butterflies. But yeah, I think that's something we can all work towards doing. So I really appreciate your comments on that. I did have a couple of questions from people in the Facebook group who had some queries about feeders. One was from Karin, who lives in Finland, and it was also echoed by Boris, who lives in Lithuania, about how would this particular feeder, the Finches Friend feeder, how would it cope with sub-zero temperatures like, minus 20? This is something that they have to deal with, and plastic can become very brittle.
Funnily enough, in my industrial past, I've provided products into places as cold as Archangel, where it goes down to minus 40. So I know the issues around that. I asked the manufacturers of the plastics that we use what the limitations are, and they're happy that the material will be okay at minus 20. The bonding we use is okay at minus 20, but in truth, with anything, the only way to really be sure is to test.
Mike from England asked, once feeders have become damaged and can no longer be used, I'm sure, this would be a very long time into the future, but can they be recycled?
Oh, okay. So, that was an issue that we took very seriously when we did the development. So, Finches Friend feeders are made from polycarbonate. Polycarbonate would come under Schedule 7 on the plastics list, but which effectively is other plastics, is all that really says. But polycarbonate is a very interesting material in as much as most plastics, when they're used in the manufacturing process, change their molecular structure. Polycarbonate doesn't. It's exactly the same structure after it's been molded as it was before. The beauty of that means that it can simply be melted and reused to make something else. So there are complicating factors. Obviously, the feeder is not purely plastics. It's got bonding agents and screws and those things involved in it. But the answer with a Finches Friend feeder is that polycarbonate can be and is widely recycled. It would need to go to your local recycling centre rather than simply being put in the plastics in the bin. And it may be that some centres would ask for it to be stripped, in other words, to remove a label and screws. But effectively, polycarbonate is infinitely recyclable. So once it's been produced, even if we get issues in manufacturing where something is not of an acceptable standard or colour or something's gone wrong, we can simply shred it and make feeders from it again. So that's the beauty of polycarbonate.
That's the beauty of having an industrial designer. He knows his stuff. I had no idea about that. It's fascinating.
No, absolutely. And one other question we had was from John, also from England, who asked whether we should feed all year. And I think we've covered some of that. And is there a food that attracts the greatest variety of birds?
My own personal view is that many of the mixes are really for our benefit, not for the birds. You will find that often you'll get a mix that the birds go through, and it takes particular species, they don't all do it, but they'll simply go through it to find what they want, and they turf out an enormous amount of wheat and stuff like that, fillers on the ground. So I personally only feed sunflower hearts, and we have never had anything that won't take them. Even my goldfinches prefer sunflower hearts to Niger seed, which everybody kind of felt was the perfect thing for goldfinches. So my personal view, and again, not scientific, I'm always keen to make that clear. I just feed sunflower hearts.
I'm exactly the same. I've gone through exactly the same process. I had mixed because I thought somehow that would benefit a wider range of species. Then you watch the nuthatch in there just chucking it absolutely everywhere. But with the sunflower seeds, that is the least wastage that I've ever come across. And they seem to, you can watch them. I've got one of Dick's window feeders up, and they'll come in and they'll take one seed and go, and there's very little done. But I also have fat balls from the same supplier because the great spotted woodpecker and the long-tailed tits seem to like that as well. So I have them side by side. But as I say, because I've learned from the Finches Friend feeder the importance of cleaning, I actually now clean the fat ball cleaner as well at the same time.
Yeah. And I would echo both of what you've said. Now, I do have a mix that I put out on a ground feeding tray, which I will review this now, having sat through listening to what you were saying about them walking through food. But I only put a small amount out and it's gone in half a day. So there's not a lot of contact with the birds. They're just eating it. But my other feeders are all sunflower hearts because I found everything seems to like them. And I've even got, in fact, the first bird that went to my Finches Friend feeder was a blue tit. The second bird that I've seen on it was a dunnock. And that might surprise you. I've got a sunflower seed feeder in a regular port. That was the one that was out anyway before I had the Finches Friend one up. And I've still left it out at a different part of the garden. And this dunnock has been taking seed from it. And I was really shocked the other day to see that it actually had found to get a seed from the Finches Friend feeder as well. So I'll try and get some video but the thing is, it's so rare to actually catch them in the act. But I have got a little camera that can sit by a feeder. So I might try setting that up because for the dunnocks to take them. Yeah, no, I've had dunnocks. Yeah, I've had dunnocks take sunflower seeds before, from feeders. But this one it's going regularly to the old feeder, the old style feeder. But I actually saw it go onto the Finches Friend.
I think that's another wonderful example of the flexibility and the plasticity of animal behavior, because I think when I was a student, we were taught animal behavior almost as if they were pre-programmed to do things in exactly the same way. And yet you quickly discover that they are characters and they're different individuals and they'll behave in very different ways. I've never heard of a dunnock actually coming, because all my dunnocks are down on the ground.
Over the years, I've definitely had several dunnocks and the robin as well doing this. It makes you realise that they are watching the other birds and seeing where they're finding food. And probably what's happened is the dunnock has seen the robin do it, which is a similar kind of build. And because the way this feeder hangs near to a hedge where the dunnocks are hanging out, it doesn't take much for it to creep up in the hedge, so it's nice and secure. It pops out onto the feeder, grabs a seed and back into the hedge again. So it's a very minimal kind of interaction. But I was very pleased to see it on the Finches Friend. But if I can get video, I'll share it with you.
Great.
But yes, but they're always looking around and always learning from others. They're not just, like you say, they're not just little robots out in the garden.
I think that you made an incredibly interesting point there, though, in that kind of proves that human intervention, our providing our wild bird feeders, is actually changing natural behaviour. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a reality that we change their behavior. We we impose ourselves one way or another as human beings on the natural world. And it could be a great thing. It could be that they're getting food where they simply would starve. But equally, it could be where they're getting disease where they wouldn't have got it before. One other thing I'd just like to mention, whole peanuts through Finches Friend is a bad idea. We were talking about what food to put in. Don't put whole peanuts in. And also fat balls, not at fledging time. I've seen blue tits feed it to their chicks and kill them. So that's
really
just another small...
So the
it's
whole
a winter
peanuts, so the whole peanuts, you would always advocate having the chipped peanuts or having peanuts within a feeder that means they can only take small pieces.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear about the innovation that's gone on. It is actually wonderful to know that you looked at your own birds and you've been able to do something that now will benefit birds all over. Are there any other things that you'd like to share before we finish today?
I'd like to share, I don't know how it impacts on what we've been talking about, but I made a film some years ago on Springwatch, and it was a chap in Holt who'd BTO chap, and he'd managed to put colour rings on the blackbirds coming into his garden. He had a license to do it, obviously. So you could tell individuals, and he got his mum, not him, his mum, to sit there and record the different individuals coming into his garden. And the day I went to film with her, guess how many different individuals had come into her garden? 74.
You're joking.
74 different individual blackbirds had come into her garden. I was absolutely amazed by this. So it does remind us that the garden birds, you think, oh, that's my blackbird. It's probably not your blackbird. They're just moving around, checking all the time, looking for other food resources the whole time. So the more we can get easier to clean feeders out there, it needs to be a big thing. It's no good if it's one garden surrounded by 20 others who aren't doing anything. So this is why doing what we're doing now, trying to get the message out there, is so important.
Please do go and look at the Finches Friend website at finchesfriend.com, where you can buy your own feeders and see videos of them in use. Also, Martin Hughes-Games has a book out right now, A Wildlife, My Adventures Around the World Filming Wildlife. It's about his 30 years of being a producer of wildlife documentaries and of his time on Springwatch and Autumn Watch. You can find out more about him by going to his website, martinhughesgames.co.uk. And if you want to find out more about garden bird health, please take a look at the leaflets produced by Garden Wildlife Health, GWH, which is a collaborative project between the Zoological Society of London, the British Trust for Ornithology, FrogLife, and the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, which aims to monitor the health of and identify disease threats to British wildlife. The link is in the episode notes. My thanks to Randy Braun for designing the artwork for the show. The theme music is Short Sleeve Shirt by the Drones. Thanks to them for letting me use it. Check out their website at dronesmusic.net. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me again for another episode of the Casual Birder podcast.